There was no evidence that Mr. Noriega was involved in drugs, no hard evidence until we indicted him.
Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system.
Oh, we don't mess around in other people's elections, Jim?
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Rackets podcast. I'm your host, Brian Sadie. In this podcast, we discuss all kinds of different forms of rackets. It's typically in the line of organized crime or drug cartels, corrupt politicians, crony capitalists of the sort. And obviously that content is really negative in many ways, but it's very necessary for the public to know about. And I'm just going to kind of warn you ahead of time that the topic for today is even darker than usual. What I wanted to discuss was there's a spiritual practice known as Falun Gong that originated in China back in the early 90s. And the practitioners of this, their numbers really grew in very high numbers. Estimates as high as 70 million practitioners by like the mid-90s. And eventually what happened was the Chinese government started to persecute this group in many ways, false imprisonment, abuse, surveillance, torture, and in the most extreme cases, many of these people were executed by the Chinese government and their organs were sold for profit within the Chinese medical system. There's long been evidence of this, and in many ways it's kind of gone out of the public eye, this issue. But in recent news, the British government is actually considering a bill to ban the sale of organ transplants from China. So I really wanted to discuss this topic, and I really have the foremost expert on this issue. His name's Leon Lee. He's a Vancouver-based director, and again, I think he really produced the foremost resource on this topic. It's called Human Harvest, China's Illegal Organ Trade. It's a Peabody Award-winning film. I recommend everybody watch it, and I just want to introduce him to the show again. Welcome to the show, Leon.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much. Again, most of the audience is based in the U.S., and I think that this is a topic that the average American is not familiar with. So I was kind of hoping just to kind of back it up a little bit, and if you could tell people about a little bit about the Falun Gong and just some of the conclusions of your research.
Yes, Falun Gong is an ancient spiritual practice that was made public in China in 1992, and it grew rapidly, as you said in the introduction. By 1999, the Chinese government estimated that there were more than 70 million to 100 million people in China practicing Falun Gong. And for a long time, it was welcomed and even supported by the Chinese regime. Then Chinese premier once even said that if everybody practices Falun Gong in China, the government would save billions of dollars in healthcare expenses. I also remember that the Chinese ambassador to Canada once said to his guests in a function that if you want to know more about traditional Chinese culture, you should learn Falun Gong. So now looking back, this is almost unimaginable that a Chinese official would say things like this. Mm-hmm. So by the way, you also see lots of positive reporting of Falun Gong on state media in China. Knowing that all these media are controlled by the Communist Party, you sort of know the government's attitude. But as I mentioned, by 1999, the practitioners of Falun Gong outnumbered the membership of the Chinese Communist Party, which was at about 60 million at that time. So then President Jiang Zemin apparently was not happy with the situation and launched a brutal crackdown. He ordered Falun Gong to be eradicated within 3 months. Of course, now it's almost 20 years and the persecution still continues. Many people have tried to understand the rationale behind the persecution. Now, I'm not an expert on Falun Gong, but after my interview with many practitioners and China experts, I think there are probably three causes behind the persecution. One is the one I already mentioned. The sheer number of practitioners was sort of threatening to the communist regime. But that's not really the real reason. The second reason behind the persecution is that Falun Gong believes in truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. The Communist Party, on the other hand, functions based on propaganda and violence. So if a large number of the population actually believe in truth and they insist on telling people the truth, this is not what the party wants to see. And the third reason, which is also very important, is that the communist regime in China, in its essence, is an atheist regime. So since it took power in 1949, it systematically eradicated religions and spiritual beliefs in China. Now, of course, if you go to China, you can see churches, you see temples, but they're all under very strict control. As a matter of fact, if you are a Christian and you celebrate Christmas with several friends at home, that is illegal. You can be labeled as participating in house church, underground church activities, and you can be arrested. And recently, there are reports that the governments are taking down crosses and burn them nationwide. They also banned all previous translations of the Bible. You can only buy one version now that's being translated by the government. I haven't read it yet, but I guess the translation is somewhat different. So the idea is that if there is if there's a higher moral authority, whatever that is, even higher than the communist leaders themselves, then the Communist Party doesn't like it.
Sure.
So that's the reason why this particular practice was targeted, because the number of practitioners, this became one of the most severe human rights violations in China now.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm kind of just curious from a personal standpoint, because as far as your film, you direct it really sort of in a third-party sense. You point to these very high-profile individuals, such as the former Secretary of State in Canada. But when did you first kind of come upon that this persecution was taking place?
Oh, the persecution itself, it was well known, because in the beginning of the persecution back in 1999, when I was still in China, in the beginning, the state TV broadcast anti-Falun Gong programming 23 hours a day.
Oh.
And during the first month of the persecution, I think major newspapers in China published hundreds and thousands of articles criticizing Falun Gong. So schools, companies, all kinds of organizations, they would require their members or staff or students to get together and sign on the big banner denouncing Falun Gong. So almost no one could escape such intensive propaganda. But in terms of forced organ harvesting, I only came to learn about it in 2006.
Okay. If you maybe would just kind of give us some of the details that you came across.
Absolutely. In 2006, I believe there was an allegation that was publicized. Basically, they were saying there was a hospital in northeastern China, actually not too far from my hometown, called Sujiatun. And someone came out who was a nurse, who was not a nurse actually. She was working in the hospital, and she claimed that her husband was involved in removing more than 2,000 corneas from Falun Gong practitioners for organ transplantation. And she said that these people were killed, and their other organs were also harvested. So there was such allegation that came out, and my initial reaction was one of complete disbelief.
Right.
I had known about organ harvesting from death row inmates for a long time. This is really an open secret, but I just couldn't believe that the government was harvesting organs from Falun Gong practitioners. And because they were essentially prisoners of conscience, they were not doing anything wrong. They were not even sentenced, and they were just killed for their organs. So when you hear a crime like this, I think people naturally don't believe it. And so I didn't believe it. But I couldn't let it go. Somehow I wanted to look into it. I wanted to know more. So it was at the time that David Matus and David Kilgore, two Canadians who were the pioneers in this investigation, launched their own work to try to find out what's going on. So I eventually got in touch with them. I read their report. It was titled Bloody Harvest. And sometime later, an American investigative journalist, Ethan Gutman, also got involved. And they actually joined forces and published a update recently titled Bloody Harvest / The Slaughter, an update. So these three were really the experts in this area. And after talking to them and examining what they were able to uncover, I was convinced that this is really happening. So I thought maybe many people would have the same reaction as I did. Maybe it's a good idea to make a documentary so that the viewers can become investigators, just like the three gentlemen I mentioned, and look at the evidence by themselves and draw their own conclusion. So that was the idea behind Human Harvest. What I did not know at the time was that the film would take 8 years to complete, and we would be able to get so many incredible testimonies from different people, from doctors to patients, from Falun Gong practitioners to the relatives of the patients. So these all painted a picture. I think at this point, for any person to, if they really want to look into it and examine all these evidence, there's really no longer an argument on whether this is happening.
I would fully agree. If you don't mind, because I mean, the basic rationale in favor of that argument is that the numbers really don't add up as far as the number of potential organ donors versus the people receiving these organs. And in the film, you cite a lot of different stats, and obviously I know it's tough to go off memory, but if you could maybe get into like some generalities as far as, you know, just for somebody who hasn't seen the film to kind of explain that.
Yes, there are lots of evidence that suggests that this is actually happening. And as you mentioned, one is the number of transplant surgeries in China and the possible sources of these organs. Now, according to the report I mentioned, Bloody Harvest / Slaughter, an update, they looked into, they had a very comprehensive study, basically looking into what the journals would say, what different news reports would say, and how many beds or in each department, organ transplant departments in different hospitals. And they were able to come up with a number, an estimate between 60,000 to 100,000 transplants are performed each year in China. Bear in mind that China doesn't really publish its official data on how many transplants are done for a long time. Now they do. They claim it's about 10,000 each year, but it doesn't match with lots of other data that people were able to find. So the 60,000 to 100,000 transplants performed each year are still a very conservative estimate. So the question is, where do they get all these organs? For a long time, the Chinese government said, in the beginning, they even denied that they were sourcing from death row inmates. But later on, they admitted they were from death row inmates. So how many people were executed each year in China? That's another number that most people don't really know because it was considered a secret. But there are various estimates. The high estimate that's agreed upon by different organizations are about 10,000 each year. Again, for a long time, before 2010, there was no organ donation programs in China. And the culture in China is that people do not want to donate their organs after they died. So really, if there was no organ donation system and people don't want to donate their organs, and there were only a maximum of 10,000 death row inmates, and because of tissue match and blood match, and because that many of the people on death row inmates have poor health condition, they may be drug addicts, they may be alcoholics, or there's a high hepatitis rate in Chinese prison, sometimes more than 50%. So all this adding together is just very unlikely that death row inmates are the major source of organs in China. So there's the discrepancy about numbers, but more importantly, there's also about time, how long it takes to get a organ in China. Now, in the US or in Canada or in the UK, if you want a kidney transplant, there's probably, I haven't checked the latest stats, but when I checked several years ago, it was about 2 years of wait time, sometimes even longer. But the patients I interviewed, I came across, and the many other patients who reported in the other sources, it takes them a week, 2 weeks, a month to get an organ. And in certain cases, your surgery is also, you can schedule your transplant surgery.
Right.
Now, after you take out the organ from whoever, you can only, there's a number of hours that you must perform the surgery. Otherwise, the organ sort of expires. Now, different organs are different numbers. Some 4 hours, 6 hours, some are longer. But if you can schedule your surgery weeks ahead, that means you sort of have a large number of organ donors waiting there, so you can do your tissue match, do your blood match. When everything matches, and you can just come, and at the time, the organ will be sourced. So all these things point to a terrible, terrible crime happening, not only in one part of China, but nationwide. But of course, if this is only circumstantial evidence, then we started looking into it in other ways. We started calling hospitals in China and pretending to be a patient or a relative of a patient who needs organ transplants. Now, because the investigators were speaking Mandarin, and it is not an uncommon thing for an overseas Chinese to call the Chinese doctors and asking about organ transplants for their relatives. So many doctors were happy to take the phone calls, and after verifying their identity, the investigator asked questions about organs, about where they came from. Now, of course, as soon as you mention Falun Gong and you mention some of the sensitive things, many doctors stop talking, or they would say, "Oh, I can't talk about this on the phone. Come back and let's meet in person." But still, there were about 15% of the doctors who openly admitted that they were using organs from Falun Gong practitioners. And they were telling the investigators how good these organs are because Falun Gong practitioners have a healthy lifestyle. 15% not only in one place, but if you map it out, it's all over China. And very interestingly, we also had the Chinese state television who made a documentary about these phone calls. And the doctor who came out and said, "I never said those things." But we do have the recording of the phone call, the transcripts, and everything. So at least the Chinese government did us a favor by verifying the identity of that person who took the phone call that day. He was indeed a doctor working in this hospital, and he was indeed a transplant surgeon. So there were many evidence like this, and in the film, we were also able to interview, we included testimony from a surgeon who did the surgery, who actually removed kidneys from a death row inmate, but that person before he was killed. So when he removed the organs, he was still alive. We interviewed Falun Gong practitioners who were in custody and who also heard from the guards about organ harvesting. So if you look at the whole picture, it becomes more clear on what is going on. And of course, there are various international organizations trying to get inside China, but China never allowed independent investigation into this allegation.
It's really something else. Your film was released in 2014. One thing that I'm curious about, and it, at least from the outside looking at it, it seems that the organ trade is just as plentiful. Every report seems to say that anybody going for an organ transplant in China, currently the conditions are basically the same. The wait time's like a couple weeks or so. You pay a lot of money, but you can get an organ really quick. Do you have any reason to believe that that this trade has slowed down at all? Since even though your film has received a ton of publicity and it has created a lot of awareness on the subject.
I think we did have several governments taking actions, Spain, Israel, Taiwan, passing different kinds of legislations, banning their citizens from going to China for organ transplantation. So on the demand side, there was some action being taken. China switched from defense to assault. So they are lobbying international organizations. They are touting that the reforms they have been put into place, and they claim that they also made a promise that they would stop using organs from death row inmates. But very soon, people find out all they did was to reclassify this kind of prisoners. They basically said the death row inmates, U.S. talk about human rights, right? So death row inmates should also have human rights. Therefore, they should be allowed to donate their organs if they want. So overnight, all these death row inmates are voluntarily donating their organs, and that's why they're saying they're not using death row inmates' organs anymore. The overall situation hasn't really changed dramatically. It's probably a little more difficult for Westerners or other foreigners patients to get organs in China because they are more secretive.
Mm-hmm.
In the beginning, for a long time, foreign patients were the priority because they pay more. But now I think domestic wealthy patients probably have higher priority. doesn't mean they have stopped the operation at all. And the other thing is also Falun Gong was the main source of organs for a long time. Now I think certainly Falun Gong practitioners are still the victim, but the Uyghurs, the Muslims in Xinjiang, they have also become a big target. There was a report, I forgot when, but it was talking about DNA testing for the Uyghurs. And over 90% or 95% of the more than 14 million of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, they have been DNA tested. And there was reports, concerns that they may be subject to organ harvesting at a large scale. But the thing is, when you keep over 2 million people or even more in these education camps, chances are something horrible is happening. And it was reviewed by Uyghur doctor, Dr. Enver Toti, that soon after these camps were built in Xinjiang, there was a so-called green channel opened in Urumqi Airport, which is the capital of Xinjiang. This green channel or fast track, if you like, is for organ transplants, for organs. If you only ship 1 or 2 organs a day, you don't need a designated fast track at the airport. So many people are worried that something horrible is happening in these camps.
Wow, because that was something that's been on my mind. There's been a lot of media coverage, not enough in my opinion, but what's happening with the Uyghurs. But it's been sort of, I guess, a suspicion on my part, because there is that correlation. The Falun Gong, they were all blood tested, and now we're seeing this DNA testing and rounding them up in what the Chinese government likes to call their version of labor camps or re-education camps. And again, there's just a lot of parallels. Exactly. I didn't know if there was much evidence as far as organ harvesting, but it is something that I'm concerned with, to say the least. It doesn't seem like you're one much for speculation, but do you have any ideas as to why you think that the Chinese government really hasn't had a whole lot of pushback on something that's just so horrific and that's taken place on such a large scale?
In terms of Western governments?
Really, any government. I mean, I have my suspicions. I'm just kind of curious if you have your own.
Well, I've talked to lots of people for the film, and many of them are in different positions in various governments, but they would not speak to me on camera. So, here's the thing: major Western governments are fully aware of what's going on. I have no doubt about it at this point. Many of them learned about it a long time ago. I think it was in 2000, and there were evidence suggests that in 2002 or 3, at least the U.S. government was fully aware of what's going on. I suppose this is, once that they acknowledge this crime against humanity, then they also have to do something about it.
Yeah.
But something about it is very difficult for all kinds of reasons: international relations, trade, political interest. So maybe it's easier to just turn a blind eye and see where things go. So that's probably, if you ask me, why there was no stronger action taken by different governments. On the Parliament and Congress level, we do have some action, at least. U.S. Congress passed House Resolution 343 unanimously, and European Parliament has a similar resolution. Canadian side, the Canadian Senate, there was a committee on human rights that also passed on some sort of resolution condemning China on organ harvesting and the persecution against Falun Gong. But governmental-wise, apart from a handful of governments who have taken action, most just kept silent.
Yeah, it might not be widely reported in the U.S., but I mean, you go back to 2001, there was an actual Chinese army doctor who testified before Congress, and he went into great detail. I don't remember how many executions that he said that he was responsible for, but he went into great detail, even testified as far as like the money trail and how all of this works. So again, yeah, the U.S. government at least has heard this evidence publicly. I think it's exactly what you're saying. China does have a lot of soft power. Their Belt and Road project, I think, is really gaining them a lot of leverage geopolitically. They're a major holder of U.S. foreign debt. You know, they have a lot of leverage as far as geopolitics is concerned. And since there isn't that much publicity with this issue, it kind of gives political leaders the ability to look the other way. Oh, go ahead.
Yes. Yeah. There was testimony by the military surgeon, but also if you look at the human rights report by U.S. Department of State, there were several years they mentioned about persecution of Falun Gong and also organ harvesting. So the fact that it was included in the report also suggests that they are certainly aware of the issue.
Wow. Yeah. I guess, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to add?
This is an ongoing thing, and I think there are various organizations working on ending the crime in China now. If you want to learn more, a very good resource is the report I mentioned, Bloody Harvest, a Slaughter, an update by David Matus, David Kilgore, and Ethan Gutman. And if you look at, they have done a very comprehensive study and listed all the sources of their information. I think if anybody, if they look at this report, they will learn a great deal about what's going on. Certainly, you can also watch my film, Human Harvest, which is on various digital platforms. That's not as comprehensive as the report, but perhaps a little easier to digest, if you like.
Right.
And also, there are many other organizations. You do a Google search, you can find quite a few of them. You can follow the situation, and if you do care about the situation, you can also do something about it by sharing on your social media, write to your representatives. I think if more governments realize that their people also care about this thing happening in China, then this will be changed.
Yeah, I fully agree. I'm going to link to everything that you mentioned there. I'm also going to link to an extra report. It's by a guy, Torsten Trey, of Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting. And it's a recent article from late last year and kind of gets into the numbers of just how it's just mathematically impossible for them to be able to explain their organ transplant market without force or coercion. And again, I do really recommend that everybody see your film. I think like I said, it's a great resource. If this issue is new to you, like you said, it's probably a little easier to digest at first, and you can research even further. But yeah, I just want to thank you again for coming on the show. Thank you for really all that you've done. This is a major human rights catastrophe that more people need to know about. I would like to thank the audience as well. And just like you said, please share this episode. If you could give it a 5-star rating. And the last thing I do ask, if you do want to support the podcast, you can do it a number of ways, but one of the ways is to go out there and grab a copy of my 3-book series called Rackets. It's on the legalization of drugs and gambling and the decriminalization of prostitution. So until next time, thank you much.
It's a big club, and you ain't in it.
I am concerned that the size of some of these institutions becomes so large that it does become difficult for us to prosecute.
You can have a license. Price is $250,000 plus a monthly payment of 5% of the gross of all 4 hotels in the store. Corleone.